Hospitals failed in layers. Power went first, comms next, and then the lies. At 3 in the morning, the lie was glowing green on Morgan Hayes' monitor, bright and impossible. 190 on the heart rate, 80/40 on the pressure. The pager clipped to her waistband gave its dirty analog buzz against her hip. The old dead man's switch vibration from a life she kept pretending was over, and she killed the thought before it could slow her hands. First things first, she focused on the artery, the blood, and the holes somebody had punched through this kid's chest with money. The man on the table looked barely old enough to rent a car. He had neck tattoos and wore a cheap chain. Sweat ran cold through the stubble along his jaw. He had the same half-starved, half-feral look half the South Side dragged through this ER after midnight. He had the same busted knuckles and the same bad ink. It was the same stubborn little spark that kept them alive long after common sense quit. Morgan had stayed in this rotten place for a reason. There were no committees and no polished lies, just bodies and numbers and the ugly truth between them. His pulse was trying to claw its way out of him, while his pressure sagged toward the floor. That wasn't street chemistry, that was design. Under the table, Trench let out a low vibration that rose through the steel frame and into the soles of her shoes. He gave no bark, never a bark, just that deep sub-vocal warning that meant he'd smelled the room change before the humans had. The triage bay stank of bleach, fryer grease blown in from the street, and the sharp animal reek of stress hormones. It smelled of cortisol and adrenaline. Panic had a smell once you'd lived around enough men who died hard. Morgan leaned closer, one gloved hand spreading tissue, the other guiding the forceps into the wound track, just below the clavicle. The heart monitor answered with a wet electrical chatter that made the fluorescent light sound sick by comparison. A nurse hovered near her shoulder and asked whether she wanted surgery called. Morgan ignored him. Surgery upstairs would ask for imaging, signatures, and coverage, all the rituals people hid behind when they were scared to act. She preferred steel and pressure, and the kind of decision that left no room for committee input. The kid jerked when she probed deeper. Blood flowed out dark, too dark, almost syrup black under the light. He should have been fading faster. He should have been screaming less. He should have been obeying physics. Instead, his body was running like a race engine, with no oil left in it, all heat and noise and no future. Metal clicked under the forceps. It felt hard, small, and wrong. Morgan adjusted the angle, pinched down, and drew the slug out a fraction at a time. It came free slick with blood and colder than it had any right to be, landing in her palm with a weight that didn't match its size. She looked once and knew, 5.7 by 28. It had a steel core and was armor-piercing. It was a mean little round built to argue with Kevlar, not ribs under a thrift store hoodie. Street punks in this neighborhood bought garbage hollow points and prayed over jammed pistols. They did not spend $30 a shot on military-grade ammunition. Morgan rolled her thumb across the knuckle of her index finger once. O-O-D-A, loop. Observe, orient, and do not waste words. Someone had paid real money to put this kid down, and someone like that never fired one round unless the cleanup was already moving. Trench's growl thickened under the table. The tray beside Morgan trembled with it. She slid the bullet into the chest pocket of her green scrubs and packed the wound harder until the kid cried out. Good. Sound meant circulation. Sound meant maybe one more minute. She clamped what she could, snapped for O negative without raising her voice, and finally lifted her eyes toward the half-open curtain. Noise from the hallway came in pieces. There were wheels, voices, and rubber soles. Then came one set of steps, under all of it. Measured and efficient, the heel touching first, before the rest of the foot rolled through. It was not a nurse, not security, and not any hospital employee trying to survive the back half of a night shift. This gait wasted nothing. It was quiet, balanced, and professional. Morgan felt the scene, lock into place with ugly clarity. She noted the impossible vitals, the dark blood, the expensive bullet, and the predator scent. The patient wasn't random. The shooting wasn't random. Whatever had wound up inside his bloodstream had brought trained men to a rundown ER at 3 in the morning. And they were close enough now that Trench was ready to put his body across the gap. Morgan stripped off her gloves, dragged on a fresh pair, and checked the dressing one last time. The monitor still screamed 190, while the cuff whispered 80/40. The kid's pupils lagged half a beat too long. Drugs, then. It was not neighborhood trash, but something engineered and something ugly. Her pager buzzed again against her hip. She silenced it with the back of her wrist and turned toward the hall, calm as a blade laid flat on a tray. Somewhere out there, a professional had stepped into her ER to finish the job. Morgan hit the swinging door with her shoulder and came out of triage, still feeling the cold shape of the 5.7 by 28 round against her scrub pocket. The chief of medicine found her 3 steps later and opened with volume instead of sense. "Hayes, what the hell happened in my bay?" His voice cracked across the hallway, bouncing off tile and fluorescent hum, and the thin privacy curtains that never gave anyone any privacy worth naming. Morgan kept walking. 30 feet ahead, a man in borrowed blue scrubs pushed a drug cart toward the nurse's station with the smooth patience of somebody who didn't belong in a hurry. She didn't look at his face first. Faces lied, but feet told the truth. His heel touched before his toe. He kept a tight roll and protected his weight on the right side, where the scrub top hung a fraction too square at the hip. He carried a compact pistol, probably suppressed if he was as disciplined as he looked. The chief moved into her peripheral vision, still barking about contamination, paperwork, and liability. All the holy scripture of men who confused authority with usefulness. Morgan let him talk, better loud than observant. The fake nurse kept coming, guiding the cart around a family cluster and an abandoned wheelchair without losing that careful center of gravity. Hospital people learned to move tired. This guy moved loaded. Morgan slowed just enough to let the chief crowd closer. Then, she let a hemostat slip from her fingers. The metal hit the linoleum with a clean, hard crack and spun under a chair. That was signal 1. Trench slid out from the triage bay without a sound, his scarred muzzle low, shoulders flowing between steel legs and rubber wheels like he'd been poured there. Morgan tapped 2 fingers against her thigh. That was signal 2. The dog angled toward the far double doors, cutting off the clean exit line, while the fake nurse registered him with one tiny break in rhythm. Good. He saw the dog. Better yet, he saw the dog before he saw her move. The chief drew breath to start up again, and Morgan cut him off without looking at him. His pressure is 80/40, 1 beat. That dressing blows because you needed a management speech? You can explain the bleeding scene to the county. The words landed exactly where she wanted them. The chief flinched and stepped left on reflex, putting his body between her and the angle from the approaching cart. He became free cover, human, soft, and indignant. Gideon Thorne came through the corridor with a mop bucket and that right-legged hitch that made most people stop seeing him after half a glance. Morgan never made that mistake. Old men with hands like split oak and eyes that calm had usually earned them. He passed close enough for her to catch bleach, machine oil, and the faint metallic smell that clung to old tools. A black plastic bag hung from one fist. He let it drop onto the stainless prep table beside her. The thing landed with a dead, heavy thump that pulled the chief's attention for one precious second. Morgan grabbed the twisted handles. It felt dense with metal inside, not loose junk or trash. Gideon kept his eyes on the floor and muttered out of one side of his mouth like he was talking to the mop. "You're a mechanic, fix it." He offered no lecture and no explanation. Then he limped on, bucket wheels squeaking softly behind him. The fake nurse saw the handoff and lost that borrowed hospital expression altogether. His right hand drifted toward his pocket. He moved not fast and not panicked, confirming his target before transitioning to a solution. Morgan felt her own breathing flatten. The bullet in her pocket, the impossible vitals, and the bag in her hand all painted a clear picture. The room had finally admitted what Trench had known from the start. The chief found his voice again, louder now, because fear had climbed into it. Morgan stepped into that noise and weaponized it. Do you want the Joint Commission reading about a contaminated trauma corridor? Or do you want this floor cleared now? She didn't wait for the answer. Men like him answered procedure faster than plain English. He turned and started shoving a transporter, a med student, and one bewildered cousin out of the path, widening the mess without realizing he was widening a lane for her. At the far doors, Trench planted himself and lifted his lip just enough to show his titanium canine. The fake nurse stopped his cart. For the first time, he looked straight at Morgan, and there was nothing medical in his eyes. He showed no fatigue and no irritation, just distance, angle, and calculation. Morgan pivoted behind the chief's shoulder, hugged the plastic bag tight against her ribs, and moved for the half-hidden service door behind a linen rack and a failing exit sign. She did not run. Running triggered crowds, and crowds got people killed. She pushed through the door into the stairwell gloom as Trench shifted sideways to block pursuit, projecting controlled menace and low vibration through the metal threshold. The latch slammed behind her. There was a hard metal bang. Then the hallway noise collapsed into a muffled blur. The air smelled of dust, old concrete, coolant, and basement drafts. Morgan stood one beat in the sudden quiet and listened to the sound of her own breathing in the stairwell. The bag dragged at her arm, blood dried on her sleeve. On the far side of the door, something thudded once, then stopped. Men with expensive ammunition were willing to kill for whatever Gideon had handed her. That meant the answer was downstairs. The stairwell dumped Morgan into the chop shop like a throat-clearing blood. The room smelled of concrete, old coolant, rust, and wet dust. The room had once been storage, then maintenance, then whatever broke too badly upstairs got dragged down here and stripped for parts. She saw gurney wheels, dead monitors, IV poles with bent hooks, and a cracked anesthesia cart with one drawer hanging open like a jaw. She shoved the door shut behind her, dropped the bar, and stood still long enough to hear what the silence was doing. Trench stayed on the far side. He was a good dog, with bad timing. Her own breathing came back at her off the walls, rougher than she liked. The black plastic bag dragged at her arm, dense and ugly. When she set it on a steel workbench and untwisted the handles, something inside struck metal with a dull, expensive thud. Morgan peeled the bag open and found matte aluminum under the fluorescent spill from the stairwell bulb. It was heavy, scarred, and military grade. It was not surplus store military, but real military. It was the kind built for rain, impact, and deniability. She pulled the box free with both hands. Rough edges bit through her gloves where rust had bloomed along one seam. A 13-digit NSN had been stamped into the shell, deep enough to survive fire, flood, and bureaucrats. She read it once and felt her stomach go a degree colder. It was not because she knew the exact item code, but because nobody stamped a full NSN into junk meant to disappear. Across the room, above a rack of dead infusion pumps, a faded yellow sign warned FOD in block red letters, the kind of thing meant for people who worked around aircraft or machinery that ate mistakes for breakfast, foreign object debris. It was the wrong room for that sign, and the wrong sign for a hospital basement. Gideon hadn't handed her a random black box. He had handed her something that had lived inside a chain of custody, then fallen out of it hard enough to draw blood. Morgan turned the case over. She saw no keypad, no handle, and no visible screws. There was one cracked optic plate where a retinal scanner had probably once sat. Beside it, recessed under a shield lip, rested a sensor well ringed in black. She set the box down flat and looked at the bag again. A smear of old blood darkened the twisted plastic where Gideon's hand had gripped it. Morgan rubbed her thumb across her knuckle once. Observe, orient, and do not get cute. The optic was dead. The shell was intact. The sensor well had no dust inside it, which meant it still mattered. It was a nuclear biometric lock. Then she had seen uglier in theater medicine supply chains. Little pieces of paranoid engineering designed by people who trusted Fallout more than passwords. Morgan scraped a fingernail along the blood crust on the bag, lifted a flake, then pressed it with the tip of a trauma swab until it softened dark and tacky. Gideon was old MACVSOG, old medicine, and had old government habits that never really left the body. She held the swab over the sensor a second longer than she needed to. If this was wrong, nothing happened. If it was right, something stupid happened fast. Upstairs, muffled through concrete and pipes, she thought she heard the faint metallic cough of a door being tested. Then she touched the blood to the well. The effect was instant and mean. A hard click came from inside the box, followed by a rising electronic whine, no bigger than a breath and far more dangerous. The lid popped a 1/4 inch. Every fluorescent tube in the chop shop blew at once. Glass popped sharp overhead. Bulbs shattered with fast white cracks. Tiny pieces rained down across steel and concrete. It was not bright, but violent. A fist of static hit the room. Morgan flinched on pure nerve memory as the micro EMP rolled through the basement and tore the power out by the roots. Monitors died. A soldering iron snapped dark. Somewhere in the walls, breakers overloaded and relays fried with a stink of burnt ozone that filled her nose and coated the back of her tongue. Then the darkness landed. It was not dim and not shadowed, but completely crushed. Red emergency glow bled alive a heartbeat later from one old hardened laptop on the bench, the only machine in the room still standing. An alarm kicked in upstairs, then another, feeding into a shrill federal fire tone that sounded too organized to be accidental. Morgan leaned over the laptop as the screen resolved in block text. Level 8 clearance required. Location logged. Recovery team dispatched. Fail-safe in 45 minutes. She read it once, then again, because sometimes bad news improved on the second pass. It didn't. 45 minutes, it was not to solve it, but to survive it. Whatever Gideon had dropped into her hands had just announced her exact location to somebody who paid for cleanup in teams. The thermite started as a hiss behind the steel door, soft enough to mistake for bad wiring if you were stupid or hopeful. Morgan was neither. She stood in the dark chop shop with the red emergency wash painting, everything artery dull, and counted the seconds between the hiss and the first orange drip pushing under the seal. It was fast, too fast for city cops, and too disciplined for hired local muscle. This was a recovery team. She could hear them now through the door in broken pieces. Boots adjusting, gear brushing concrete. There was one clipped burst of radio traffic from a voice too flat to belong to anyone scared. It was Vaughn, probably. He would be outside with a 4-tube NVG rig and a contract in his pocket, running a clean breach under rules written by men who wanted witnesses dead and buildings intact. Morgan's eyes swept the room once and stopped on the standing oxygen cylinder chained near the old anesthesia rack. It was 50 liters, full, heavy as sin, and good enough. She moved before the cut burned through. The cylinder clanged when she yanked it free, the sound too loud in the dark. Morgan gritted her teeth and muscled it down onto a rubber mat, feeling the strain jump through her shoulders. The regulator was hospital issue, thick-necked and stubborn. She grabbed the short-handled sledge from beneath the workbench and set her feet. The steel door gave a brighter spit of molten orange. Somebody outside said something she couldn't catch. Then Vaughn's voice came over the radio, calm as bookkeeping. Check the blind spots. Hold formation. Do not shoot the gas cylinders. There it was, their cage. There would be no explosives, no stray rounds into the oxygen lines, and no headlines. Morgan almost smiled. Policy had more mercy in it than people did. She slammed the hammer into the regulator housing once. Metal rang. She struck it again. The valve bent. She hit it again, harder, and the stem snapped sideways with a sharp metallic crack that made the cylinder jerk under her hands like a live thing. 50 liters of oxygen came out screaming. The sound wasn't a hiss now. It was a tearing, ear-piercing shriek that ripped through the room and turned the cylinder into a blind white force. Air blasted across the floor hard enough to shove loose tools skittering under cabinets. Dust, foil wrappers, old gauze, and plastic packaging went airborne at once. A spinning wall of debris built to bloom straight into night optics. Morgan shoved the cylinder with her boot, forcing the escaping jet to angle toward the steel door, just as the thermite cut finished, and the slab lurched inward. Light from the hall speared through the gap. Then the oxygen plume hit it, bursting into a storm of grit, frost, trash, and pressure. Men outside cursed and staggered back. One of them shouted, "Blind," with that sudden blast in his tubes. Morgan took 2 steps to clear the line and paid for it immediately. The broken regulator spun once under the force, and a shard of metal came off it flat and fast. It hit her left bicep like a hot knife thrown by a machine. There was no clean movie pane and no tidy gasp. It was just a white spike that blanked the room, and a brutal punch of impact deep enough to make her knees dip. She slapped her right hand over the wound on instinct and felt warmth burst through her glove. For one dumb second, she thought the fragment had buried itself there. Then she felt the edge of torn fabric, the slick open split in muscle under it, and the blood running down to her elbow in fast, wet, hot ropes. Morgan bit down on a curse so hard her jaw clicked. The oxygen shriek kept drilling into her skull. Somewhere beyond it, boots were regrouping. They were not retreating, as it was never that easy. She crouched and dragged herself sideways behind an overturned instrument cart, leaving a wet smear on the concrete. Her arm throbbed in bright, sharp pulses that matched the angry beat in her throat. There was no hero wonder and no clean win. It was just a trap that had worked and flesh that had paid for it. Red emergency light made the blood look black where it soaked into her sleeve. Morgan ripped a length of gauze from an open drawer with her teeth, wrapped it hard around the bicep one-handed, and cinched it until the pressure made sparks dance at the edge of her vision. It was not enough to stop the bleed, but enough to slow the leak and keep the smell from turning the room into a map. She forced her breathing down. Listen. Outside the blasted doorway, the recovery team shifted to a slower rhythm. They were cautious now and smarter. One man went low, another high, and one covered the far corners. Vaughn said something quiet over comms, then louder, with the same dead tone as before. Thermal spread, watch the blind zones. Morgan leaned her head back against the steel cart frame for half a second and let the pain settle into something useful. Her left arm burned. Her palm was slick. The dark had gotten thicker now that the oxygen plume was thinning, and that was the only good thing left in the room. They had optics, and she had angles. They had formation, and she had a wound, a workbench full of broken hospital hardware, and nowhere to go but deeper in. The first man crossed the threshold then, a black shape with 4 dead green lenses over his face. Morgan pulled farther into the optical blind spot and waited, blood tapping the floor beside her shoe like a clock starting over. The first merc cleared the doorway slowly, holding his rifle high, while 4 green tubes washed dead light over the room. Morgan stayed flattened beneath the steel table, with her cheek almost against the concrete, her left arm tucked hard against her ribs to keep the blood from dripping too fast. The gauze she'd cinched over the bicep had already gone hot and slick. Every pulse pushed another warm line down toward her elbow. The man's boots crossed a band of yellow-black paint stenciled on the floor beside an old turbine housing she'd dragged here months ago because the thing had looked useful. The warning said Jet Blast in chipped letters. It was cute, in a basement full of dead hospital gear and live problems. Behind the first merc came a second shadow. He held a lower rifle and maintained tighter spacing. He moved exactly the way Vaughn's kind always moved when the room had already bitten one of their own. There was no chatter and no wasted motion, just pure method. Somewhere above them, Trench scraped along sheet metal in the ventilation run, his weight shifting overhead like a held breath. Morgan found the loose power cord with the toe of her shoe and waited until the lead merc gave her one more step. Then she kicked. The plug snapped free, arced once, and the halogen rig came alive with a white blast so hard it felt physical. It was not just light, but impact. The old surgical lamps had been ugly even before she wired them to backup batteries, and now they poured straight into the merc's night optics at point-blank range. The room exploded inside his goggles. He shouted, not words, just pain and reflex, jerking backward with both hands coming up too late. The second man caught spill from the beam and lurched sideways into a rack of ruined pumps, his rifle muzzle skating wildly across the ceiling. One round coughed into concrete. Another slapped sparks off a dead monitor. Morgan smelled dust, hot wiring, and scorched paint. She didn't move yet. She didn't waste the opening. You only got one clean second when the other guy's electronics turned against him, and if you blew it, you spent the rest of the night paying interest. Her thumb hit the tiny IR clicker clipped inside her pocket. It was a blink, nothing a naked eye would catch in the emergency wash, but Trench didn't need eyes for that side of the world. The vent grill over the breach rattled once. Then the dog came out of it like gravity had changed its mind. He dropped square onto the lead merc's chest, not going for the throat, not losing discipline. He went straight for the comms unit, clipped to the plate carrier. The titanium canine hit first, with a deafening metallic clash that rang through the chop shop like somebody had struck an anvil. Plastic shattered, and the antenna snapped. The man slammed backward into the blown door, clawing at the dog and getting blood and wires for his trouble. Trench ripped free with the busted radio in his teeth and vanished under another table before the second merc could line up a shot. The room filled with blind firing. Short, ugly coughs from suppressed rifles went nowhere useful. Vaughn barked something over a channel that no longer existed. Good. Let him manage silence for a while. Morgan used that silence like a scalpel. She rolled onto one knee behind the steel table and dragged an old suture tray toward her with her good hand. The movement nearly blacked her out. Her left arm felt full of broken glass. She clamped the torn edges of the bicep against the table leg, bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted iron, and found the curved needle by touch. Her heart hammered against her ribs, pumping adrenaline through her exhausted system as she forced herself to focus. Her fingers were slick. She wiped them once against her scrub pants, threaded the holder, and jammed the point through her own skin. There was no ceremony and no countdown. The pain hit with a weird, clean brightness, deeper and colder than the original cut, and time went watery around it. She could feel the exact path of the needle under the surface. She felt the drag as it bit muscle, and the awful friction when it punched out the other side. The suture thread followed with a raw, sick pull that made her jaw lock so hard her molars screamed. Morgan kept going. She pushed it in, drove it through, pulled it tight, and started again. The room around her had narrowed to thread, breath, blood loss, and the distant crash of men trying to recover their formation. She finished the third pass, yanked the knot down tight, and nearly laughed at how ugly it was. Good enough. That was the standard down here. It was good enough to keep the arm attached, and good enough to keep firing solutions and oxygen valves and bad ideas on the table for another few minutes. Sweat ran off her nose and spotted the steel. Trench slid back into view under the next workbench, his muzzle dark radio carcass hanging from one side of his mouth before he dropped it with a metallic clatter. Outside the halogen glare, one merc was still half blind, slamming shoulder first into shelving while he tried to rip the ruined NVGs off his face. The other had gone prone and was sweeping low, disciplined again now, angling for the shot he should have had 20 seconds ago. Morgan tucked the needle holder into her pocket, cinched the fresh suture flatter against her arm, and forced herself lower as the beam from the lamps burned a hard white lane across the floor. Their comms were dead and their optics had been burned. But Vaughn was still out there, and the men inside were finally angry enough to get dangerous. Morgan pressed her palm to the concrete, felt the vibration of boots repositioning, and realized the next problem was already moving behind her. She felt him before she heard him. There was a weight shift in the dark behind her, and air moving where it shouldn't. Then, tactical wire kissed her throat and snapped tight so fast it felt like her neck had been plugged into a live socket. Morgan's chin jerked up. The world narrowed to pressure. A thin, brutal line was digging under the jaw and crushing into the soft channel over her trachea. It bit deeper every time the man behind her leaned back and used his body weight like a machine. There was no cinematic struggle and no spinning escape, just instant biology. Her lungs went hot and useless. The halogen glare smeared across her vision in sick white bars while black spots started breeding at the edges. The merc didn't say a word. He smelled like wet nylon, old gun oil, and the cold outside, his boots still carrying thawing snow that had melted into the tread, his forearm locked against the back of her skull, forcing her lower. The fresh suture in her bicep screamed when she tried to lift the arm. Bad choice. She dropped it, burning lungs. That was the first real information. The second was the floor. There was still water somewhere close. The sanitizer bucket. She'd seen it earlier by the decon sink. One of those gray rolling things nobody emptied when the shift got ugly. Morgan kicked blindly with her heel, missed once, hit metal on the second try, and felt the bucket tip. Liquid rushed across the concrete with a sloppy splash, cold against her shoe and then colder as it spread under both of them. The man behind her tightened the wire harder, trying to finish it before she found another option. Her vision went starry. Sound got weird. It was far away, yet too sharp. Across the room, the defibrillator sat on a low cart where she'd shoved it hours ago after cannibalizing the battery line. She could see the paddles hanging loose, cords trailing like black veins. It was too far for a clean reach, but not too far for a dying one. Morgan forced one foot under her, dragged both bodies half a foot sideways, and clawed at the cart leg with her right hand until the whole thing jerked toward her over the wet floor. The machine hit the concrete with a crash that the man behind her probably thought was victory. Fine, let him think. Morgan snatched one paddle, thumbed the charge switch by feel, and heard the defibrillator answer with a rising electronic whine that cut straight through the panic hammering in her chest. The sound was thin and mechanical. It was almost delicate, which somehow made it meaner. The wire kept chewing into her throat. Her lungs spasmed. Every instinct in her body wanted to claw at the garrote, pry fingers, and do something stupid and mammalian. She ignored it. It was not because she was brave, but because she'd seen enough bad deaths to know panic had no imagination. The electronic tone climbed. Her captor shifted, his boots settling deeper into the spreading sanitizer water, his weight steady, his grip committed. Good. Stay planted. Stay grounded. Morgan jabbed the first paddle down into the puddle near his left boot and reached the second as the machine hit full charge with a sharp mechanical click. For one frozen beat, she could feel the whole scene suspended on that sound. She assessed the wet floor, the conductive path, and the two bodies locked together. Then she drove the second contact into the water. The current hit ugly. There was no movie spark and no graceful convulsion. It was just a brutal animal jolt that turned the merc rigid behind her and threw both of them sideways. His grip vanished all at once. The wire pulled away from her throat. Morgan fell to one knee coughing against concrete, while the man took the full insult of 360 joules through soaked boots and flooded pant legs. He came off the floor like a puppet yanked wrong, slammed shoulder first into the tiled wall, then dropped with a heavy, dead thud that shook the bucket and sent dirty sanitizer splashing under the table legs. The smell changed instantly. The air smelled of ozone, burnt fabric, and soiled clothing. Morgan sucked air like somebody had loaned her the concept at the last second. Each breath tore. Her throat felt flayed inside, every swallow a strip of hot glass. She stayed down until the coughing stopped trying to split her in half. One hand braced on the floor, the other still gripping the paddle hard enough to ache. When she finally looked up, the room had gone quieter than before. It was not safe. It was never safe. Just emptied out. 2 mercs were already down from the halogen trap, and Trench's comms kill. The man who had wired her throat lay crooked against the wall with his head turned too far and his chest still moving in stunned little twitches. He was alive, but unlucky. Morgan thumbed blood and sweat away from one eye and listened through the shrill federal alarm, still bleeding faintly from somewhere upstairs. There was no team chatter now. There was no inside movement except the tick of cooling metal and Trench's low vibration from the dark beyond the lamps. One set of boots remained outside the immediate room, deliberate and unhurried. Vaughn. Of course. He'd hang back once the room turned sloppy, let other men spin their bones finding the angles, then step in when the math got cleaner. Morgan pushed herself upright using the cart, every muscle in her body objecting. The fresh suture in her left arm pulled tight and wet. Her throat already felt swollen. She found the timer on the hardened laptop through the wash of red emergency light and read the number twice to make sure hypoxia hadn't scrambled it. 15 minutes left. 3 men were down, and 1 squad leader was still standing. Morgan rolled her thumb over her knuckle once, tasted blood in the back of her mouth, and turned toward the last set of footsteps. Vaughn didn't rush her. That was the first thing that made him dangerous. Morgan stepped out from the broken light with the defibrillator cart in front of her, like a bad shield, her throat still raw from the wire, her left arm throbbing under the crooked field stitch. Trench came first. He was low and silent, his scarred muzzle level with Vaughn's belt line, projecting a deep, floor-level growl, vibrating through the concrete. Vaughn stood near the computer desk with one hand loose at his side and the other empty on purpose, as if he were trying to make courtesy look tactical. He had already done the math. 3 men were down, comms were gone, and night optics were burned. The room belonged to Payne now, and Trench understood Payne faster than people did. Vaughn glanced once at the dog, once at Morgan, and let his shoulders ease half an inch. It was not surrender, but recalculation. Morgan saw the angle he was keeping on the desk, the old reflex toward whatever exit he thought still existed, and caught herself staring too hard at his hands. It was target fixation. There it was. It was the thing that got smart people dead. She dragged one slow breath into her scorched throat, then another, forced the room wider in her mind, and moved. She used zip ties from a crash kit because they were close, and because irony still existed, even in basements like this. Vaughn didn't fight once Trench got close enough to show his titanium tooth and profile. He only watched her with that same bored contractor calm while she kicked his ankles apart, shoved him into a steel chair, and cinched his wrists behind the backrest so tight the plastic squealed. Morgan didn't waste words on threats. Men like him cataloged threats for a living. She checked his belt, his boots, and the back of his collar, found a backup blade taped at the spine and a flat ceramic pick in one heel, then tossed both under a cabinet. Vaughn took all of it with a faint little smirk, the kind that belonged on men who trusted systems more than blood. Kill me, you die too. The board locked this sector down. His tone never rose. Morgan let the line sit there between them while she rolled the defibrillator closer to the med node and started stripping cable with blood-slick fingers. The hardened laptop still glowed red through the emergency wash, its timer chewing itself toward 0. 15 minutes had become less than that, while she'd been busy surviving. The med node sat on the workbench like a bomb that had chosen patience instead of noise. Morgan popped the battery housing on the defibrillator, rerouted the line the ugly way, and clipped power into the port she'd exposed earlier. There was no montage and no miracle. It was just old field habit and the kind of improvisation people learned when procurement lagged behind gunfire. The machine answered with a dull hum. On the med node screen, a loading bar crawled from black to red to white, each notch reflecting in Vaughn's eyes while Trench held him in place with that silent pressure only a trained dog could manage. Morgan's keyboard strokes came cold and deliberate, the clatter of cheap keys sounding almost polite against the federal alarm bleeding faintly from upstairs. Zip ties squeaked once as Vaughn tested them. Trench answered with a low growl that traveled through the chair legs. At 60%, the file tree opened. At 80%, it stopped pretending. There were internal trial notes, cardiac telemetry, and dosage logs. Civilian identifiers had been stripped, but not stripped well enough. At 100, the title came up in block text. Clinical Trial Summary. Combat Stimulant, X7. Morgan read 3 lines, and the room changed shape around her. Heart rate 190. Blood pressure 80/40. Pain suppression, despite tissue trauma. Darkened venous return. She saw the kid from Triage all over again. His chest jumping under her hands, blood too dark, pulse trying to run itself out of the body. It was not random, and not bad luck. It was not one junkie with exotic chemistry in his veins. It was a live test, one subject among others. Neighborhoods like his turned into a lab because nobody with money ever had to hear those monitors scream in person. Morgan kept scrolling. She saw photos, outcome charts, and failure windows. There were 48 hours to terminal cardiac collapse in a percentage so ugly it looked personal. Behind her, Vaughn shifted in the chair. Plastic ticked. Trench's growl deepened once, a reminder that the room had not turned safe just because the truth had arrived. Morgan's anger did not flare hot. Hot anger wasted oxygen. What came instead was colder than that. A professional kind of hatred, neat and still, and built for follow-through. Vaughn watched her read and kept that same half-smile on his mouth, like the file only proved his point. Maybe it did. Behind her ribs, rage settled into place, beside the pain, beside the timer, and beside the raw abrasion in her throat. Morgan laid one hand flat on the desk until the shaking stopped. Then she looked at Vaughn again, and this time she was done learning. What she needed next was the code that would get past the Faraday cage, and he still believed his board could save him from the math already climbing his own neck. Morgan ignored the knife drawer. That was the first crack in Vaughn's expression. It was not fear exactly, more like professional disappointment. Men like him understood pain the old-fashioned way. Broken fingers and pulled nails were theater tricks for insecure people. He had already braced himself for all that and found a kind of comfort in it, because physical torture gave him something to resist. Morgan left the drawer shut and went instead to the NARC cabinet she'd broken earlier for cleaner reasons. There were 8 minutes on the timer now, maybe less. The red digits from the laptop painted the room in a pulse that made every second look arterial. Trench stayed parked at Vaughn's knee, chin low, growl vibrating through the chair legs whenever the squad leader shifted too much. Morgan came back with a syringe, a small glass ampule, and a piece of gauze for the neck. Vaughn's eyes flicked to the syringe and then back to her face. He was still calm and still playing the part. "You're late to this," he said. The sectors sealed. Morgan snapped the ampule, drew the clear drug, tapped the barrel once, and said nothing. Silence forced people to build their own dread, and it saved time, too. She stepped in close enough to smell him now. She caught cordite buried under sweat, damp tactical fabric, and ozone from the room. The pulse in his neck sat easy for the moment, thick and steady under the skin. Morgan pressed the gauze aside with 2 fingers, found the jugular column by sight and touch, and slid the needle in. Vaughn's jaw tightened on instinct, his molars grinding under the strain. That was all. There was no shout and no flinch worth admiring. She started the push in tiny increments, not enough to dramatize it, just enough to change the body before the mind could get a vote. He gave her one annoyed look, then another look half a minute later when his breathing began to sharpen without permission. Morgan watched the vessel in his neck start to jump. "Heart rate, 120, she said, her voice flat and sanded raw from the wire. "Climbing." Vaughn tried the old contractor calm again, but it was already leaking at the edges. Sweat gathered under his hairline and tracked down toward one eyebrow. His hands flexed uselessly against the zip ties. The body always understood first. That was the beauty of it. It was not cruelty, but efficiency. You could lie with your mouth while your organs still believed in the chain of command. Past a certain point, the organs staged a coup. Morgan gave the plunger another measured push. Vaughn's pulse turned violent under the skin, thick enough to see from arm's length now. His chest began lifting too fast. Every inhale shallow, every exhale cut short, like the room had lost air pressure. The sweat came harder, rolling off his forehead, soaking his collar, and collecting at the hinge of his jaw. 150. She watched his pupils widen. The whole room seemed to tilt for him then. She knew the look. It was a sense of impending doom. That clean physiological terror hit right before the body convinced itself the end had already been scheduled, and there was still time to feel all of it. Vaughn licked dry lips. His composure didn't shatter all at once. It frayed. It started small first, his gaze twitching to the timer, his shoulders trying to pull free, though he knew they wouldn't, his throat working around air that no longer felt like enough. Morgan set 2 fingers against the artery and let him feel how hard his own pulse was hammering. 180, she said. Cardiac arrest in 20 seconds. Override code. Read it. There was no threat in her tone and no performance, just a diagnosis. He tried to spit something clever back at her and couldn't get the words lined up in time. That was the point. Past a certain heart rate, cognition stopped pretending to be king. The thinking brain got shoved aside by alarms, raw and primitive and louder than doctrine. Vaughn's eyes lost focus. He found it again, then lost it harder. The vein in his neck kicked against the needle with brutal little jumps. Sweat dropped from his nose to the front of his shirt. Trench leaned half an inch closer, and his growl deepened, enough to make the chair vibrate under the man's spine. Vaughn swallowed and started talking in bursts. 16 numbers breaking loose between ragged breaths, then repeating because panic wanted repetition, and Morgan was not in the mood to ask twice. She keyed the code into the med note as he spoke, each digit landing with the dry clack of a mechanical verdict. At the 11th number, his voice cracked. At the 16th, he made a sound that wasn't speech anymore, just a body begging itself not to fail in public. Morgan withdrew the syringe, pressed gauze to the puncture, and let him sit in the wreckage of his own chemistry. The code was real. She knew it from the machine's response, the hidden satellite module waking under the desk with a buried electronic chirp. Vaughn sagged back into the chair, shaking now despite all his training, eyes wet but still furious about it. Morgan capped the needle and set it aside. There was no triumph and no speech about justice. She wasn't built that way, and tonight had wrung whatever was left of softness out through her sleeve. The timer kept bleeding downward on the laptop. The Faraday cage was no longer the problem. The bigger problem sat above her now, far from blood and concrete, in quiet offices and guarded phone lines, and men who thought risk could be priced if you made enough of other people die first. Vaughn dragged in air like a drowning man and tried to get his mask back on, piece by piece. It was too late for that. Morgan wiped her thumb across her knuckle once and stared at the active uplink indicators blooming across the MedNode screen. She had the code. Good. That solved the small problem. The large one was uglier. How did you threaten billionaires who outsource shame along with everything else? You did not use morals, and you did not use evidence alone. You needed leverage tied to something they believed in. You needed something measurable and something they couldn't write off as noise. Morgan looked from the med node to the EKG leads hanging beside the old monitor, and a colder answer began to take shape. Morgan did not upload the file. That was what a frightened person would do. Frightened people sprayed evidence into the air and prayed the internet would grow a conscience before the men with budgets got there first. Morgan had worked around systems too long for that. Systems swallowed noise. They buried scandal under procedure, under injunctions, and under clean men in good suits talking about chain of custody and unverifiable sources. What they did not swallow well was a trigger tied to something biological, immediate, and hard to argue with. She dragged the old cardiac monitor closer with one hand, hissing once when the motion pulled at the bad stitch in her left arm. Trench stayed beside Vaughn's chair, chin low and eyes up. Vaughn watched her through chemical aftershocks still shaking him, sweat drying in a salt film along his temples. The med node pulsed faint status lights across the desk. 8 minutes had become less than that. Morgan tore open the pad packet with her teeth. The adhesive smelled clean and hospital sharp in a room that no longer deserved the word clean. She peeled open the front of her scrub top just enough and pressed the first EKG pad high against her chest. Cold gel. The second went lower on the left side, close enough to feel the rhythm under it. The third, she set to anchor the lead and keep the tracing stable if she had to move. The wires looked ridiculous for half a second, bright against skin slick with sweat and old dust and somebody else's blood. Then she clipped them in, and the monitor woke with a steady, rhythmic tone. 68. It was a beautiful number, and a human number. She was not panicked, not sedated, and not collapsing yet. She routed the signal through the MedNode's satellite uplink with movements too practiced to feel theatrical. That was the point. There was no theater, just a dead man's switch, built out of whatever the hospital basement hadn't managed to kill. Morgan glanced at Vaughn only once. "If I flatline, it dumps." Her voice came out rough from the wire burn, thin but steady. Vaughn didn't answer. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough monitors in bad rooms to know when a pulse had been turned into leverage. She pulled the emergency contact tree from the X7 files, found the number tagged for internal crisis escalation, and hit speaker. Static answered first, then a click. Then a man's voice spoke, cold and lacquered, with the kind of control people mistook for intelligence. "Security Director." He offered no name. Of course not. Names were for people who expected accountability. Morgan watched the timer burn downward while she spoke. "My heart rate is 68. It hits 0. X7 drops to the Senate. Abort the team, or I bleed out and you burn." There was silence on the line. It was not hesitation, but calculation. Somewhere inside that silence, legal exposure, contract exposure, media exposure, and congressional exposure all came out to be counted. The director did not ask whether she was bluffing. It was a good sign. Men at that level didn't waste time on questions unless they thought answers could still save money. "You are in unauthorized possession of classified federal material," he said, his voice iced flat by the speaker distortion. "Release the device." Morgan almost smiled. It was not because it was funny, but because bureaucracy really did sound the same right up to the cliff edge. No. One word was enough. The monitor kept marking her heartbeat in the background. Small, steady tones that made the whole threat impossible to reduce to abstract language. The director shifted tactics without changing tone. "Team lead, verify." That moved the room. Vaughn lifted his head slowly. His throat still worked around the remnants of adrenaline, but his contractor discipline had come back in pieces. He looked at Morgan's chest. He looked at the wires and at the lead disappearing into the med node. Then he looked at the monitor. 68. The steady rhythm sounded from the machine. He knew what an unfakeable sign looked like. He'd spent his career trying to keep ahead of them. "She's wired to her heart," he said, breathing harder than he wanted either of them to hear. "Trigger locked." The line went dead quiet again. Morgan could almost hear the accounting being done in some distant climate-controlled room. It was not morality and not fear for human life, just risk management that was cold and absolute. Then the director came back on, voice unchanged. Protocol 4. Abort. That was it. There was no speech, no bargaining, and no promise to remember her name. It was just an order shaped like a guillotine. The silence after the call was worse than the violence had been. It arrived all at once, thick and unnatural. There was no more movement outside the room. There were no boots shifting position and no last desperate push through the breach. The only sounds left were the federal alarm bleeding down from upstairs, the steady monitor beeping out Morgan 68, and Vaughn breathing through the humiliation of still being alive when the contract had already moved on without him. Trench lifted his head first. His growl faded. It was not trust, but recognition. The air had changed. Morgan waited another beat, then another, because the kind of men who ordered assassinations sometimes liked to build a final betrayal into the paperwork. Nothing came. Through the blasted doorway, a shadow crossed once and vanished. Then another. It was a clean withdrawal. It was disciplined and as bloodless as a balance sheet. The timer on the laptop froze at 2 minutes. Morgan sat down hard on the edge of the desk because her knees had started to shake without permission. The EKG pads tugged at her skin every time she breathed. Her left arm throbbed under the ugly stitch. Vaughn stared at her like he wanted to memorize the face of the inconvenience that had cost him everything tonight. Morgan looked back once, tired and cold and very nearly empty, while the monitor kept time for both of them. This was the part nobody put in patriotic speeches. It was not victory and not justice. It was just mutually assured destruction, wired through a wounded body and accepted by men who would rather lose a team than a contract. The next night, the emergency room looked exactly the way bad places always looked when money had passed through them after hours. It was bright, scrubbed, and pointlessly alive. Fluorescent light flattened everything into the same pale institutional fatigue. The cracked tile in the hallway had been mopped clean. The bullet pits were gone. The warped service door had been replaced or painted over so well it hardly mattered which. There was no blood smell and no ozone. There was no trace of the federal alarm that had screamed itself hoarse over the building less than 24 hours earlier. A janitor buffed one section of floor with the bored patience of a man who had not almost died here. A resident laughed too loudly at something on his phone. A monitor beeped in room 304 for reasons entirely unrelated to black budgets and unauthorized chemistry. The corporation had done what corporations did best. It had erased the evidence and left the labor behind. Morgan stood at the scrub sink and let cold water run over her hands until the knuckles lost feeling. Her left arm was hidden under a clean scrub jacket, the bandage flattened tight beneath the sleeve, with one small rust-colored dot blooming through, where the wound still hadn't decided to forgive her. She shut off the water with her wrist and reached for the black case sitting beside the sink. The med node felt different now that it was quiet. It had the same weight, the same matte aluminum, and the same scar at the seam. But the panic had gone out of it, leaving only the object itself, cool and pristine in her hand. Morgan had cleaned every bit of dried blood from the shell before shift. She had worked oil into the hinge until it opened without complaint. She had even buffed one thumbprint out of the faceplate because habits were habits, and some of them kept people alive longer than therapy ever would. The metal was cold enough to sting. She liked that. Cold was honest. Across the hall, Trench lay under a nurse's station desk, with his scarred muzzle on his paws, half asleep and not remotely relaxed. His left ear, the bad one, stayed folded wrong. His good eye tracked motion without moving his head. When Gideon's trash cart appeared at the far end of the corridor, Trench noticed before anyone else he didn't rise. He just thumped his tail once against the linoleum, like a man acknowledging another man's arrival without making a production out of it. Gideon pushed the cart with the same right leg hitch, his mop handle rattling faintly against a bin full of regular garbage that had nothing regular inside it if you knew where to look. He did not glance at Morgan until he was nearly even with her. That was his version of courtesy. He gave a person room to decide who they were going to be after a night like that. Morgan stepped forward and set the mednode into the cart, between a tied-off bag of medical waste and a stack of broken plastic canisters. The aluminum looked almost elegant there, which was absurd enough to be funny if anybody in the hall had earned the joke. Gideon rested one broad, calloused hand on the cart handle and looked at the box once. There was no smile and no surprise, just a small pause that carried the weight of recognition without asking for ceremony. Morgan said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. It was not a thank you, not what now, and not we won, because nobody wins these things. Not really. Gideon reached into his jacket pocket instead, came out with a strip of beef jerky, and let it drop under the desk without looking. The sound of Trench taking it was soft and dry, a rustling crunch under fluorescent light. That was the only celebration anybody got. Gideon gave one short nod, the kind old soldiers used when words felt like too much paperwork, then shifted his eyes to Morgan's sleeve, where the hidden bandage changed the way the fabric hung. He didn't mention it. He didn't need to. The respect between them lived in what stayed unsaid. Somewhere behind Morgan, a nurse called for an attending. A stretcher wheel squealed. Somebody's kid cried in curtained triage. The world had already moved on to fresh emergencies, which was another thing the world did well. Gideon started to turn his cart, then stopped just long enough to mutter out of the corner of his mouth, "Room 304, internal bleeding." It might have been an order. It might have been a joke. It might have been the only blessing either of them knew how to give. Morgan felt her thumb find the knuckle of her index finger and press once, an old habit, like an old engine turning over. "On it," she said. She left the sink, left the scrubbed hallway, and left the polished black box buried in a trash cart where it belonged for now. She walked toward the elevators, with Trench falling into step, a half-pace behind. Her throat still hurt when she swallowed. Her arm still burned under the bandage. The building had been cleaned, but not healed. Neither had she. That was fine. Healing was overrated in places built to keep taking damage. The elevator doors opened with a tired sigh. Morgan stepped inside under the pale fluorescent wash and watched the hallway narrow as the doors closed on Gideon. The cart, the nurse's station, and all of it sliding back into the ordinary. It was not peace, just work. Room 304 was waiting. So would the next lie, and the one after that. The war never ended in one glorious motion. It just changed uniforms and found better lighting. Morgan squared her shoulders, felt the hidden stitch in her arm tug once, and rode upward into another emergency with the dog beside her, and the quiet knowledge that some things had changed enough to matter, even if nobody alive in that hospital would ever write them down.